Temperatures of -40 and 50 Celsius were not uncommon.
Me taistelimme omalla maaperällä omissa olosuhteissa. Jokainen suomalainen osasi hiihtää, osasi toimia metsässä vaikeissa olosuhteissa, myöskin kovassa pakkasessa ja niin edelleen.
The Finns had snow camouflage. The Russians didn't. The Red Army troops stood out like proverbial sore thumbs. You couldn't miss them. As often as possible, the Finns tried to rotate their men so that the frontline troops at least got a few hours of warmth, a chance to have a hot meal. If you're going to fight in that kind of an environment, you have to provide a diet that's extremely rich in protein and fats. The Finns were able to do that. The Russians were, black bread and tea. At 40 below zero, a hot meal is the difference between life and death.
In mid-December, cold and hunger were the decisive factors in a battle Finns called the Sausage War. Marching through snow and ice, a Russian battalion slipped deep behind Finnish lines.
All of a sudden, this Russian raiding force erupts in the rear area. This was the Russians' big chance. They had broken through, they were behind Finnish lines. If they had just kept going, they would have cracked the whole Finnish defense line. But what stopped them was the field kitchens. The Finnish cooks had just put on enough sausage soup to feed the entire 2,000 men in that sector. When they got a whiff of the sausage soup, it completely took the wind out of the raid. Ignoring their officers, the Russians immediately went for the field kitchens.
Me jouduttiin siihen meidänkin komppani juuri keskelle sitä makkarakapinaa. Pimeä yö oli ja aina ammuttiin sinne, missä vaan leimatti. Niin sinne päin ammuttiin, ei nähnyt pimeässä mitään tähdetä.
And that's what gave the Finns time to regroup, counterattack, and virtually wipe them out.
Markers in the village churchyard honor the defenders of the Battle of Suomussalmi. Memorials on the Rata Road honor another part of the story, the elite 44th Ukrainian Division. When the 44th Division crossed into Finland, they brought along a marching band and their dress uniforms. They expected a victory parade at the end of their mission.
We can see all those stones, nearly 20,000 stones, and you can visualize that every stone is one man and he had a wife and children. Then you can imagine how much sorrow it has caused.
The 44th Division crossed into Finland on the Rata Road in mid-December. They had been sent to relieve the beleaguered 163rd Division, pinned down on roads around Suomussalmi by meager yet persistent Finnish resistance. They were then to slice across Finland and cut the country in half.
These were mechanized Soviet divisions, but the roads they were able to use, these were logging tracks. They were 1 lane wide, they were solid ice, and once the Russian columns were committed to that territory, they had to stay on the roads.
The combined forces of the 163rd and 44th Divisions totaled almost 30,000 soldiers, 335 artillery pieces, more than 100 tanks and 50 armored cars. Stretched out for 20 to 30 miles, their columns resembled huge snakes.
They would attack and try and knock out vehicles on the road in the front and vehicles at the end, so that the vehicles in between would then become stuck.
The Finns were on skis, and they could move very swiftly up and down the length of that column, and they were completely invisible. A barrage of mortar fire, hand grenades, and the ski troopers would surge out of the forest and cut the road. And then disappear on the other side of the road. And after them would come combat engineers who would widen the breach and fortify it to cut off one segment of the Russian column from the other.
They would isolate the units and cut them into what they called mottis, and motti is a measure of wood in Finland. When you chop wood and you stack it up, that's one measure of wood. And that's what they did. They chopped up these divisions.
Once these Soviet columns were chopped into mottis, they were pinned down by snipers. The cold was so intense at Suomussalmi that the instant a man was hit by a bullet and his circulation slowed, his body froze in the posture that he was standing in when he was hit.
Men are exhausted and starved. We have about 400 wounded, no petrol. Most of the horses are killed. We are almost out of ammo. Enemy is attacking us from the front. Some commanders are deserting from the battlefield. I request urgent help.
There would be no help for the 44th Division. Survivors huddled in underground dugouts against intense cold, extreme hunger, and enemy fire. One by one, they were hunted down. 1,500 Soviets were taken as prisoners of war. Captured tanks, trucks, guns, and ammunition helped replenish Finland's arsenal. Only 5,000 escaped across the border. Among them was Alexei Vinogradov, commander of the 44th Division, and his two top officers. They were arrested, court-martialed, and placed before a firing squad.
Suomussalmi is where the Finns scored their greatest triumph with Monty tactics.
Moti tactics, repeated all along Finland's northern front, stopped the Soviet offenses. Some Red Army units held out until the end of the war. None survived the Lemeti Moti.
Se tuntui vaan hirveälle, kun siellä oli paljon venäläisillä hevosia ja niillä oli niin nälkä, että ne oli syönyt kaikki ne hevosen luut. Pakkasella oli jyrsytty ja nahat oli kaviojuuria myöti hampaan jäljet, mitkä oli pakkasella syöty, että oli pientäkin rasvaa saatu.
Finland's victories made headlines around the world. 8,000 Swedes plus 800 Norwegians and Danes volunteered their services. Fundraisers were held in the United States. Supplies and equipment were donated. 350 Finnish-American volunteers sailed out of New York. At the beginning of January, after 1 month of travel, American Jack Hasey and his Iroquois Ambulance Corps volunteers finally arrived in Finland. They were immediately sent north, deep into the forests. As he and his ambulance crew picked up the wounded and transported them to field hospitals, they were in constant danger from enemy attack and from crossfire. One day, Jack's buddy nailed a sign to a tree. When he brought wounded Russians to the hospital, he saw the ferocity of feelings.
Ruskies, Ruskies, Ruskies. They hated the Russians.
He witnessed Finnish ski commandos with a more lethal form of expression. Hasey describes their handiwork in his memoir. It has become a legend of the Winter War.
A weird scene in still life. A Russian patrol standing by the side of the road, the men upright and frozen stiff in the snow, a Russian officer beside them, pistol in hand. All had had their throats cut. The officer's pistol was loaded, and not a shot had been fired.
Jack's group became known as the Lost Yankee Battalion. An American reporter tracked them down and filmed them for a newsreel that played in movie theaters across the United States. In January, sporadic fighting continued on all fronts, but after 1 full month of war, major operations by the Red Army ceased.
January was largely a lull. Both sides were regrouping. It was a time of taking stock.
The enemy's attacks in December could be compared with a badly conducted orchestra. in which the instruments were played out of time. Division after division was thrown against our positions, but the cooperation between the different arms remained bad.
In the 1930s, Stalin conducted a campaign of terror against perceived enemies of the state. It would consume the professional officer corps of the Red Army. Thousands of officers were arrested and executed, including 90% of its generals and 80% of its colonels. They were replaced with less experienced soldiers, along with a cadre of political officers. But real power was in the hands of the NKVD, a secret internal security force that reported directly to Stalin himself.
They interfered with everything, and they had the right and the authority to go in anywhere and to take very drastic measures like shooting the general, shooting anyone.
Soviet state military archives document the fate of the 76th Tank Battalion, 34th Light Tank Brigade, trapped within a moti at Lemete. In January of 1940, Battalion Commander Captain Ryazanov began to plan a breakout. But the battalion's NKVD officer opposed it. He called Ryazanov a coward. Ryazanov replied, "I am in charge. I give the orders." Only 19 men of that battalion survived the war.
For Stalin, the situation was desperate because he was worried about Hitler, even despite the treaty. He had to somehow knock the Finns out of the war.
Stalin brings in General Timoshenko, who was one of the few really good professional Red Army soldiers who had escaped the purges.
Timoshenko augmented his forces for a massive new offensive with 45 divisions, 750,000 soldiers, more than 3,000 artillery pieces, 2,000 tanks, and hundreds of fighters and bombers.
And he adjusted the strategy. Now he concentrated all the forces against the key to Finland, which was in southern Finland, the Karelian Isthmus.
Field Marshal Mannerheim monitored the Soviet buildup and understood the inevitable. As he committed the last of his reserves, Mannerheim drew confidence from the fundamental strength of his nation.
The nation stood as one man behind their armed forces in the calm and determined knowledge that the struggle must go on.
On February 1st, the Soviets resumed their offensive. Up to 2,000 artillery shells hit the Mannerheim line each day for the next 10 days.
Niin kuin helvetti ei, niin en ole käynyt tietenkään siellä, mutta tuntuu siltä, että ei sen kamalempaa tilannetta voi olla.
On February 11th, up to 250,000 shells rained down on the line. It was the largest artillery barrage since the Battle of Verdun during the First World War.
8:35, an unprecedented artillery bombardment of our entire sector. 12:15, tanks have broken through. Enemy infantry has captured part of our positions.
All Finnish reserves were thrown into battle. The Red Army could not be contained.
By the end of February 13th, on the third day of the offensive, the 123rd Rifle Division with attached armor units broke through the main defensive line. Sumo fortified area was completely destroyed.
At the end of February, Jack Hazy's work as an ambulance driver came to a sudden end. The next day, he was evacuated from the front line. At the end of February, Finnish defenders had been pushed back to a line in front of the strategic city of Viborg, headquarters for the Finnish forces on the Karelian Isthmus. Finnish defenders struggled to hold the line in front of Viborg. On March 5th, Soviet troops attempted a flanking maneuver across the frozen Gulf of Finland to surround the city of Viborg. When Finns detected columns of tanks and infantry on the ice, they fired their huge coastal batteries, 12-inch guns, intended to sink battleships.